There are folks who lose everything all at once, in a single terrible afternoon, and there are folks who lose everything slowly, one small mercy at a time, until the losing itself becomes a kind of weather they live under. Josephine Teal was the second kind. By the autumn of 1887, she had $11 to her name, a wagon with a cracked axle, and a rust-colored dog named Scout, who had not left her side since the day her husband was buried. The town of Widows Ridge, Colorado, had already decided what kind of woman she was, a fool, mostly, or worse, a woman too proud to admit she was finished. So when Josephine stood at the courthouse steps that October morning, and bid her very last coin on a padlocked, half-collapsed mountain house that no one else wanted, the whispers followed her home before she'd even turned the wagon around. She did not know, as she closed her fist around the small iron key the auctioneer dropped into her palm, that it would unlock far more than a door. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Teal and her faithful dog, Scout. If you have ever been counted out by people who thought they knew your worth, or found something precious hiding inside something the world called worthless, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear where you found your own hidden treasure. We should tell you first how Josephine came to have $11 and a broken axle instead of a home, a husband, and a future, because a woman's fall is never as sudden as the town makes it sound, and hers had been building for 3 long years before that October morning. She had come to Widow's Ridge as a bride of 22, married to a quiet, careful man named Elias Teal who kept the town's small feed store and had a way of running his thumb along a ledger page like he was smoothing a child's hair. Elias was not a rich man, but he was a steady one, and steady, in a mountain town where fortunes rose and fell with the mines, was its own kind of wealth. They had built a modest house at the edge of town, planted apple trees that hadn't yet borne fruit, and spoken, in the quiet hours before sleep, about the family they meant to raise there. Josephine kept the store's books, because she had a head for numbers sharper than her husband's, and folks in town, grudgingly, the way mountain towns grudge everything, came to trust the tidy columns she kept even more than they trusted Elias's word. It was pneumonia that took him, in the brutal February of 1884, and it took him fast. 9 days from the first cough to the last breath. Too fast for Josephine to do anything but sit beside him and hold his hand and promise him, in a voice she kept steady for his sake, that she would keep the store running, keep the trees growing, keep their small life exactly as he'd left it. She meant every word of that promise. She did not yet know how hard the mountain would make her work to keep it. The trouble had a name, and the name was Cornelius Whitlock. Whitlock ran the Ridge Mercantile Bank, the only bank for 40 miles, and he had wanted the Teal Feed Store's corner lot since before Elias ever bought it. Wanted it because it sat square between his bank and the freight road, prime ground for the kind of expansion a man like Whitlock dreamed about at night. Elias had refused him twice, politely but firmly, and Whitlock was not a man who forgot a refusal. He was, we should say plainly, the kind of man who smiled with his whole face, while doing the meanest things a smile could hide, the kind who called Josephine dear, in front of witnesses, and then quietly called in the note on Elias's small store loan, not 4 months after the funeral, citing terms so buried in fine print, that even Josephine's sharp eyes had missed them. It was not illegal, what he did. It was only cruel, dressed up as business, and in Widow's Ridge, cruelty dressed up as business rarely met any resistance at all. Josephine fought it as long as she could. She sold the good silver first, then Elias's watch, then, wincing, the apple saplings themselves, to a rancher 2 valleys over, who at least promised to let them grow. She took in mending. She sold eggs from the last 3 hens Whitlock's men hadn't already counted against the debt. Through all of it, Scout, a rust-red mutt with one ear that never stood quite right, given to her as a pup by Elias himself the spring before he died, stayed close enough to trip over, sleeping across her feet at night, as if his slight 40 pounds could hold back whatever was coming for her. When the bank finally foreclosed on the store, and the house both, in September of 1887, half the town turned out to watch the notice get nailed to her own front door, and not one of them met her eyes. A woman losing a business was, to Widow's Ridge, simply confirmation of something they'd always suspected, that a woman had no real business running one to begin with. She would tell you now, if you asked her, that the worst part wasn't the losing, it was the quiet that came after, the particular, hollow quiet of a woman standing in an empty house, with a dog who kept looking up at her, tail wagging uncertainly, waiting for her to fix whatever was wrong, the way she always had before. There is a night worth telling you about, because it explains more about Josephine than any ledger ever could. It came near the very end, 2 days before the foreclosure notice went up, when she sat alone at the kitchen table counting coins she had already counted 4 times that evening, as if a fifth counting might somehow conjure more. The lamp oil was running low, throwing long, guttering shadows across the walls Elias had built with his own hands, and Scout lay across her feet, the way he always did, a small, warm weight against the cold coming up through the floorboards. She remembered, sitting there, the particular smell of the store on a summer morning, dry oats and leather, and the sweet dust of cracked corn, and how Elias used to run his thumb down a column of figures and say, low and certain, "Numbers don't lie to you, Josie, only people do." She had believed him once. She was no longer sure the two could be so easily separated. When at last she blew out the lamp, and lay down atop the covers, still dressed, too tired even to weep, Scout climbed up beside her without being asked, which he had never once done in all his life as a dog who slept dutifully at the foot of the bed, and pressed the whole warm length of himself against her side, until her shaking finally stopped. She would think of that night often in the weeks to come, and wonder whether some animals simply know, in ways no person ever quite manages, exactly when a body needs holding. The town's judgment came dressed, as these things so often do, in the soft language of concern. Mrs. Pruitt from the dry goods store took to calling her poor dear, in a tone that carried more relish than pity. The Ridge's one newspaper, 4 pages printed weekly by a nervous young man who owed Whitlock money of his own, ran a small item calling the Teal foreclosure an unfortunate but not unexpected end to a business perhaps too ambitious for a widow's hand. 6 words that Josephine read standing in the street, in front of God and everyone, and folded so carefully into her coat pocket that the crease was still visible in the paper years later. Even the children had absorbed some diluted version of the town's verdict. She overheard 2 of them once, playing in the lane behind the feed store's empty lot, deciding between themselves and the frank, careless way of children that the widow Teal must have done something wrong, because good things didn't happen to bad businesswomen, and bad things didn't happen to good ones. It was, we should tell you plainly, nonsense of the sort towns tell themselves so they need not examine their own complicity in a person's ruin. But Josephine was 30 years old and alone, and very tired, and there were nights that nonsense felt like the only truth in the world. It was Whitlock himself, oddly enough, who set the auction date, eager to see the corner lot cleared and back in his own hands. And it was at that same courthouse auction, 3 lots down the list from her own foreclosed home, that Josephine first heard the auctioneer describe a forgotten property up in the high country, the old Halloran Mountain House, abandoned for going on 15 years, padlocked, roof half caved, sold as is for whatever the county could get for unpaid taxes. Nobody wanted it. It was too remote, too broken down, too far past the last good grazing land to be worth a rancher's trouble. The auctioneer nearly skipped the lot entirely for lack of interest. But Scout, sitting at Josephine's heel through the whole miserable morning, had gone very still at the mention of it, ears up, the loose one included, nose working the air, as though he'd caught a scent from 40 miles off. Josephine noticed. She had learned, over 3 years of losing things, to notice the rare occasions when something in her life sat up and paid attention, because so little did any more. She had $11 left in the world. The Halloran house went for $4. She would think back on that decision for the rest of her life, as the moment fortune, having spent 3 years walking past her, finally turned around to look. The mountain house sat 2 hours up a switchback trail that had not seen real maintenance since the Hallorans themselves vanished from local memory. Old-timers said only that the family had left sudden and strange sometime in the early 70s, though nobody agreed on why, and the stories that survived had the vague, softened edges of tales told too many times by people who never actually knew the truth. Josephine walked the trail leading her wagon horse by hand, the cracked axle groaning with every rut, Scout trotting ahead, and circling back, and trotting ahead again, unable to contain some restlessness she couldn't name, and he clearly could. She had asked around town, in the days before she made the climb, whether anyone remembered the Halloran family at all, and had gotten back only fragments, none of them matching. One old-timer swore the family had struck it rich, and moved east to Chicago without so much as a goodbye. Another insisted, just as certainly, that they'd been run off by a hard winter, and a run of bad luck with their stock. A third, an old freighter named Cobb, who'd hauled lumber through the valley since before the war, said only that he remembered a spring morning in '72, when the Halloran wagon had come down off the mountain fast, and never once slowed. The whole family crowded onto the buckboard, with barely half their belongings, Margaret Halloran's face, as he remembered it, white as a February sky, and not once looking back. Nobody in Widow's Ridge, it seemed, had ever bothered to ask why. It was easier, Josephine supposed, to let a family's leaving become a shrug and a rumor, than to ask what, exactly, might have frightened them off a mountain they'd worked for 14 years. She thought of Cobb's account again, as the house first came into view through a break in the pines, smaller and sadder than even his description had prepared her for, and yet there was something in the set of it, low against the mountainside, with its back to the wind, that spoke of people who had built with real care, real intention to stay. The house itself, when it finally appeared through the pines, was smaller and sadder than she'd pictured. A single-story log structure with a stone chimney, a porch sagging at one corner like a shoulder shrugged too many times, and windows gone milky with 15 winters of grime. The smell hit her before she'd even climbed the porch steps. Old pine sap gone dark and resinous. Wood smoke that had soaked so deep into the timbers it had become part of the house's own scent. And beneath it, faint and strange, something mineral, cold iron and old stone, like the inside of a well. The key the auctioneer had given her turned in the door's heavy iron lock, with a groan that seemed to come from the whole house at once, as though it had been holding its breath for 15 years, and was only now allowed to let it out. Inside, dust lay thick as felt over everything. A table, 2 chairs, a cold hearth, a narrow bed frame stripped down to its ropes. It was, by any honest measure, a ruin. Josephine stood in the doorway a long moment, the weight of the rusted key still warm in her palm from the walk, wondering with a small, sinking feeling whether she had spent her very last $4 on nothing more than a place to catch her death of cold come winter. Scout did not share her doubt. The moment he crossed the threshold, his whole manner changed. The aimless, restless trotting sharpened into something purposeful, nose low, tail stiff and alert. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, and began scratching, hard and insistent, at a particular floorboard, beside the cold hearth, whining low in his throat, the sound less like curiosity, and more like grief, or memory, the sound, Josephine would later think, of a creature who has found something he recognizes, without knowing how. Scout! Scout, come away from there! He didn't. If anything, the scratching grew more urgent, his claws splintering at the old wood, and when Josephine finally crossed the room and knelt beside him, she saw why. The floorboard was not quite like the others. It sat a hair's width higher, its grain running crosswise instead of with the rest of the floor, and when she pressed her fingers to its edge, It lifted with almost no resistance at all, as if it had been lifted and replaced, gently, many times before. Beneath it lay a shallow compartment carved directly into the earth beneath the house, lined with what had once been oiled cloth, now brittle and dark with age. Inside the compartment, a tin document box, rusted at its corners but sealed tight, and resting atop it, deliberately placed, a single folded letter, its paper gone the soft brown of old tea. We should tell you now, because it is the kind of thing that changes everything a person thought they knew about the days ahead, that what Josephine found inside that tin box would, within the month, turn the whole of Widow's Ridge upside down. But that morning, kneeling on a dusty floor with her dog trembling against her side, she knew only that her hands were shaking as she lifted the letter free. The letter was dated the 4th of March, 1872, and signed by a woman named Margaret Halloran. Josephine read it twice through by the light of the milky window, Scout's chin resting heavy and watchful on her knee the whole while, as though he understood, in whatever way a dog understands such things, that this was a moment that mattered. Margaret Halloran's letter was not, as Josephine had half expected, some tale of buried gold. It was something stranger, and in its way, more valuable. The Hallorans, the letter explained in a hand grown shaky toward its end, had come to this mountain in 1858, among the very first settlers of the valley, and Margaret's late husband had filed one of the original water claims on the creek that ran down through what was now the whole of Widow's Ridge Township, a claim that predated every other water right in the valley, including, Josephine would soon learn, the elaborate system of fees and permissions by which the Ridge Mercantile Bank had spent a decade quietly buying up control of the town's water access, charging ranchers and homesteaders alike for what should, by the oldest and most senior claim on record, have been free. The family had left the mountains suddenly, Margaret's letter explained with a bitterness that had not faded even after 15 years of silence, because a man newly arrived to the valley, young, ambitious, already circling the banking trade, had threatened her ailing husband and their grown sons, until they agreed to let the original claim paperwork go missing from the county recorder's office, believing themselves too poor and too tired to fight a man already gathering power in the valley. Margaret had not been willing to let the claim simply vanish. She had kept the original filing, the surveyor's map, and a sworn notarized copy, safe inside the tin box, hidden beneath her own hearth, in case anyone ever came looking, or in case, as she wrote in a final line that made the hair on Josephine's arms rise, someone braver than us finds it, and finishes what we could not. She did not name the man. She had not needed to. The dates matched too precisely, the description too exactly, for Josephine to doubt for one moment that the ambitious young man Margaret Halloran described, the one who had driven a whole family from their mountain home to seize a water claim worth a fortune, was a younger version of the same Cornelius Whitlock, who now sat behind his mahogany desk at the Ridge Mercantile Bank, smiling his whole-faced smile at every widow he ruined. Scout, as though he too understood the shape of what they'd found, let out a single low bark, not fear, not warning, but something closer to triumph, and pressed his head hard into Josephine's side. She sat a long time on that dusty floor with the letter in her lap, the cold iron weight of the tin box against her knee, and felt something she had not felt in 3 long years of losing, the unfamiliar, electric shape of hope. Beneath the letter, folded twice more, and pressed flat against the bottom of the tin, she found the surveyor's map itself, brittle along its creases, the ink gone the color of weak tea, but the lines of it still sharp enough to read. The creek marked in careful cross-hatching, the Halloran claim boundary inked bold against the paler markings of every claim filed after it, and in the corner, small and precise, a surveyor's seal she did not recognize, but would soon learn was among the oldest still on record in the territory. Beneath the map lay one final item, wrapped in a scrap of oiled leather so old it had gone stiff as bark, a notarized copy of the claim itself, complete with a witnessed signature that was not Margaret Halloran's at all, but her husband's. dated a full 2 years before the family's sudden departure, proof enough on its own. Josephine would later learn that the claim had been filed properly and in good order long before any dispute over it ever began. It took her the better part of an hour, sitting on that cold floor with Scout's chin heavy on her knee, to understand the full shape of what she was holding, and longer still to understand what it might mean for a woman with nothing left to lose. We won't keep you waiting to find out just how far that meaning would reach. Far enough, in the end, to touch every family in the valley. But Josephine herself, that first afternoon, understood only the smallest, most immediate truth of it, that the ruin she had bought for $4 desperate was not a ruin at all, but the truest inheritance the mountain had to offer, and that she was, whatever else came of it, no longer entirely alone in her fight. We won't pretend the road from there to justice was short, or that it went unchallenged, because within 2 weeks, word had somehow reached Cornelius Whitlock that the widow Teal had been seen carrying an old tin box down from the abandoned Halloran place, and men like Whitlock do not survive as long as he had, by ignoring rumors that touch their own fortunes. He came to her one gray afternoon in early November, driving his own polished trap up the trail she'd only recently repaired herself, plank by plank, with money she did not have. He came smiling, as he always did, and he came with an offer. $300, cash, for the mountain house, and whatever old papers you might have found up there, dear. County records are a tangle, best left to men who understand them. It was, Josephine understood at once, both an offer and a threat wearing the same coat, and it told her more plainly than any letter could have that Margaret Halloran's claim was every bit as real and as dangerous as it seemed. Scout, who had greeted every visitor to the mountain house with cautious tail wags in the weeks since, would not go near Whitlock at all. He placed himself instead, squarely between the banker's polished boots and the hearth, where the tin box was hidden once more beneath its floorboard, hackles raised along his spine, a low steady growl rolling out of him that Josephine had never once heard him make. Not for wolves on the trail, not for strangers, not even for the county man who'd nailed the foreclosure notice to her old front door. It was the sound of an animal who understood, in whatever wordless way dogs understand danger, exactly which of the two people on that porch meant her harm. "Your dog," Whitlock said, smile flickering for just a moment at its edges, "seems poorly trained." "He's better trained than most men I've met," Josephine answered, and shut the door. That should have been the end of it, if Whitlock had been a man who accepted defeat gracefully. He was not. Within the week, he had filed a formal challenge at the county recorder's office, disputing the validity of any water claim originating from an untraceable and likely fraudulent document, and quietly begun calling in favors from every rancher and merchant in Widow's Ridge who owed him money, which was, by that point, very nearly everyone, reminding each of them, in his careful smiling way, precisely who held their notes, and precisely how unwise it would be to side publicly against him. He tried, too, a quieter and crueler tactic, one that Josephine did not learn of until much later. He sent word to the Territorial Land Office suggesting that the widow Teal, grief-addled and desperate, might have forged the Halloran documents herself, and requested, politely, on bank letterhead, with all the smiling menace he could fit onto a single page, that any claim she filed be held for extended review. It was the kind of maneuver that could have buried Margaret Halloran's truth for another 15 years, tied up in territorial paperwork, until Josephine's own resolve, or her own money for the fight, ran dry. It was only Surveyor Gray's stubborn insistence on cross-referencing the original plat books himself, unpaid and unasked by anyone but his own sense of what was right, that kept the challenge from working exactly as Whitlock intended. There are moments, we think, when a whole outcome turns on the quiet decency of one uncelebrated man doing his job with more care than anyone required of him, and Otis Gray's 3 days in a dusty territorial archive was one of them. though nobody in Widow's Ridge would learn to say his name with any reverence until long after the dust had settled. Whitlock was not finished either, with more personal forms of pressure. He rode up to the mountain house himself a second time that November, alone this time, no polished trap, only a saddle horse, and a manner gone considerably less smiling than before. He found Josephine splitting kindling on the porch, Scout stretched in a patch of thin autumn sun beside her, and he did not bother with pleasantries. "You ought to think hard, Mrs. Teal, about what a woman alone stands to lose fighting a bank," he said, not raising his voice, which somehow made the words land harder than shouting would have. "Reputations are fragile things. So is credit. So, for that matter, is a roof over one's head, and I understand the county assessor has some very particular thoughts about the fire safety of that chimney." It was, Josephine understood at once, no longer merely a business threat, but something closer to the same cruelty that had cost Margaret Halloran her home 15 years before, and it told her, more clearly than any document could, precisely what kind of man they were truly up against, and precisely why the fight ahead would need to be won in full daylight, before the whole of the town, or not won at all. She set down her hatchet, looked him full in the face, and answered him the only way that felt honest. "You threatened a family off this mountain once already, Mr. Whitlock, and thought nobody would ever come looking. I'd think hard, if I were you, about what a bank stands to lose when somebody finally does. Here is the bigger truth we promised to bring you to, the one Josephine herself did not yet see coming. Whitlock's greed for that corner lot years earlier, the same cruelty that had cost her the feed store and the home she and Elias had built together, was about to unravel the very empire he'd spent 15 years quietly building on another family's stolen water rights. And it would take more than an old letter to finish him. It would take the whole town watching, and it would take Scout, one more time, refusing to let go. The town meeting was called for the second Saturday of December, held in the same courthouse where Josephine had bid her last $4 on a ruin 2 months before, and by the time she arrived, Scout at her heel, the tin box wrapped carefully in oilcloth under her arm, Margaret Halloran's original letter pressed flat inside her coat, the room was already packed tight with every rancher, merchant, and homesteader in the valley who paid Whitlock's water fees, all of them murmuring, none of them yet certain which way to look. Whitlock had come prepared for a fight, flanked by his own hired attorney from Denver, ready to dismiss the whole claim as an old widow's desperate fiction. What he had not prepared for was the county surveyor Josephine had quietly ridden 3 days to fetch from the territorial seat the week before, a meticulous, unbribable man named Otis Gray who had, at Josephine's request, cross-referenced the Halloran survey map against the original county plat books still held in the territorial archive, and found them to match, line for line, down to the surveyor's own original signature. It was not the map alone that turned the room though, it was Scout. As Whitlock's Denver attorney rose to argue, loudly, and at great length, that the claim was almost certainly a forgery cooked up by a grieving desperate woman with nothing left to lose, Scout, who had sat quiet and watchful at Josephine's feet through the whole proceeding, rose without any command at all, walked the length of the courthouse aisle, and sat himself down directly in front of Cornelius Whitlock, staring up at the man with an unwavering, unblinking intensity that made even the hardened ranchers in the back rows go quiet. He did not growl, he did not bark, he simply looked, and would not stop looking, the way he had looked at the false floorboard weeks before, as though he had found, once again, exactly the thing that did not belong. It was a small moment, and by every reasonable measure it proved nothing at all in the eyes of the law. But a courtroom, like any room full of people, runs on more than law alone, and there was something in the sight of that steady, unflinching dog, fixed on Whitlock's face, that seemed to loosen every tongue in the room at once. An old rancher named Pruitt stood first, admitting in a rough, ashamed voice that Whitlock had raised his water fee 3 times in 5 years, under threat of foreclosure. then the widow Anders, then the Doyle brothers. One by one, the town's silence, the same silence that had let Josephine be ruined without a word of protest 2 months before, broke apart into a flood of grievances 15 years in the holding. Whitlock's smile did not survive the afternoon. By the time Surveyor Gray formally certified the Halloran claim before the assembled county judge, and the judge, over the sputtering objection of the Denver attorney, ordered every water fee Whitlock had collected under the disputed claim repaid to the ranchers and homesteaders who'd paid it, the bank's own reserves could not begin to cover the sum. Cornelius Whitlock lost the mercantile bank within the month, lost the mansion he'd built on the strength of it within the season, and left Widow's Ridge before the spring thaw, on a stagecoach nobody bothered to see off. The corner lot where Elias's feed store had stood, seized so coldly 3 years before, came back onto the market not long after, and it was Josephine, with the first real money she'd held in years, who bought it back. She did not rebuild the feed store as it had been. She built something better, a small trading post and public well house, with the senior Halloran water claim, restored now fully to public record, in Margaret Halloran's name and Josephine's both, guaranteeing free water access to every rancher and homesteader in the valley, exactly as it should have been 15 years before. She kept the mountain house too, repaired plank by plank across 2 long summers, and it became, in time, less a ruin, and more a kind of quiet monument. The place, folks in town liked to say, where the widow Teal's luck finally turned, though Josephine herself always corrected them gently. It was not luck, she'd say. It was a dog who wouldn't stop scratching at a floor everyone else had walked over for 15 years without a second thought. Scout lived a long, easy life after that, spoiled thoroughly by half the valley's children, who grew up hearing the story of the dog who'd found buried treasure, and knew, even at their young age, that the treasure had never really been the tin box at all. It had been the truth inside it, and the courage of a woman willing to carry that truth all the way to a courthouse full of people who'd once looked away from her. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in watching the overlooked prove, in the end, to be the very thing that was overlooked in error. A broken-down mountain house, a woman the whole town had written off, a dog nobody thought to take seriously. We find ourselves drawn back to Josephine's story again and again for that reason, not because treasure is rare, but because the willingness to look closely at what everyone else has dismissed is rarer still. So we'll leave you with the same question Josephine herself must have asked, kneeling on that dusty floor with an old letter trembling in her hands. If you found a hidden piece of history, something the world had forgotten, something with the power to set an old wrong right, would you keep it quietly for yourself, or would you carry it, however far, however hard the road, back to the people it was always meant to help? Until next time, stay close.